Okay, good morning.
The horse that won the Derby yesterday, if you trace back his ancestry, his great Zadie was in Sacramento.
Good morning. Welcome to our special class on the upcoming holiday of Shavuot. But today, I'd like to talk about a Jewish holiday called Mother's Day. Because, as we'll see soon, the first Mother's Day was really the holiday of Shavuot. Because the holiday of Shavuot features, among many other themes, the importance of women in transmitting the values of Judaism. So it's the real Mother's Day. But we'll get to that soon. Shavuot earns the dubious distinction of being the least observed Jewish holiday in America. It seems that 9 out of 10 Jews, or maybe even more, have never heard of this holiday. Everyone knows about Pesach, Passover, the Seder. We know of Hanukkah, thanks to the non-Jewish holiday of that time. Jews know about Hanukkah as well. We know of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, even Sukkot, Simchas Torah. These are holidays that have relative significance to American Jewry. But Shavuot seems to be the one lost holiday. And the irony here is that it's the most important holiday. There'd be no other holidays without this one. Every aspect of Judaism, every practice, every mitzvah, every holiday is based on the Torah that was given to us on Shavuos. Where do we see the importance of this holiday translated into our behavior? No other holiday has as many days of preparation as the holiday of Shavuos. In Judaism, preparation is a sign of how important something is. That it's not just a passing day. It's not just a experience that you have one day and then it's over. Preparation for something means that you're internalizing it. It's something that you can't just feel in passing. You have to prepare so it has an internalizing effect on a person. You know, in Hasidic literature, we're taught that among the intellectual powers that we have the power of das, of dat. And what is that power? That's the power of being able to attach yourself to a subject. That it's not just something in the mind that you understand, that you grasp, that you could analyze, you could discuss, you could elaborate on. That's all very nice. But until it reaches das, until it really enters into your consciousness, by attaching yourself to it, it's not yours. You don't acquire it. It doesn't belong to you. It's just something on the periphery. So in that sense, this holiday requires tremendous amount of preparation. And how many days of preparation do we have for this holiday? I'll give you 49 guesses. You guessed, 49. Which is also 7 weeks. The Torah speaks about 49 days and 7 weeks. And why is this holiday called Shavuot? What does Shavuot mean? It means weeks. Because this holiday was created by preparation for 7 weeks. This is a holiday that doesn't just come, you have to prepare for it. And what's also interesting about this holiday, the Torah doesn't tell you when it is, based on the day of the month. Every other holiday, the Torah tells you what month it is and what day of the month. Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the 7th month. Sukkot is the 15th day of the 7th month. Yom Kippur is the 10th day. Passover is the 15th day of Nisan. But when it comes to Shavuot, the Torah doesn't tell you which month it's in or which day of the month. It just tells you count 50 days. 49 days of preparation. The 50th day is the holiday. Why doesn't it give you the date? Because Shavuot transcends time. Shavuot is not just something that relates to a certain day. It relates to every day. And the way we get to Shavuot is by preparing through 49 days or 7 weeks, whichever comes first. You prepare for the holiday, and that's how you celebrate Shavuot. If you don't prepare for the holiday, it's a nice day. We have nice customs. We eat cheesecake. We eat pizza. Not me, but some people do eat pizza. But we eat dairy foods. We have a nice few customs on this holiday, but that's not called really living this holiday. You have to prepare for it. The truth of the matter is, it's possible for Shavuot to be observed not on the same day every year. We keep it on the 6th day of Sivan. But it's possible, even today, that it should be the 5th or the 7th. And this is the Rebbe's innovative concept, that if you're traveling over the international date line, where your day changes, but you don't change, your counting remains constant. If today is the 22nd day of the Omer, as it's called, and if I travel to Australia, they're going to be a day later. But tonight's still going to be the 23rd for me. For them, it's the 24th. So if I stay in Australia, they're going to have Shavuot a day before me. And vice versa, if I'm crossing the international date line the other direction, Shavuot will be a day earlier for everyone else, and for me it'll be a day later. See, so Shavuot is not fixed to a day of the month, it's fixed to 49 days of preparation. And what do we do in these 49 days of preparation? Well, there's a very simple ceremony. We count the days. Last night we said it, you could say it all day. Today is 22 days, which are 3 weeks and 1 day of the Omer. What is the Omer about? We'll talk a little bit about later if we have time. So that's, by way of introduction, establishing that Shavuot is not a small holiday, a minor holiday. It's a major, major holiday. And so are all Jewish holidays, major holidays. But in a certain sense, if you think about it, without Shavuot, we wouldn't have any other holiday. Shavuot is also connected to Pesach, to Passover. How is it connected to Passover? Number one, we start counting the days, the second day of Passover. The Torah says the day after the holiday being the first day of Passover, you start counting the days. But it goes beyond that. Some of you may be old enough to remember when God was speaking to Moses. That was a joke. When God was speaking to Moses, telling him to be the liberator of the Jews, and Moshe demurred, he would say, no, I'm not worthy. And then he throws in this argument. He says, are the Jewish people worthy of being liberated? He didn't think that highly of his own people at that time, it seems. Are they worthy of being liberated? And God says, they're going to serve me on this mountain. What does that mean? What kind of response is that? If I tell you, you're not deserving to come into my classroom, if I'm a teacher, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough. And then you tell me, but in a year I'm going to be going to college. I mean, how does that justify liberating the Jewish people who, in Moses' estimation, were not worthy of being liberated? So God says, yes, they're worthy, not because of what they did, but because of what they're going to do. So that's a question that many commentators ask. And there are many answers, but one answer, a very simple answer, is Moses knew that God was going to liberate the Jewish people, and that would bring them freedom with all the benefits of freedom. But he was concerned that the people would fall right back into slavery. If not slaves to Pharaoh, slaves to whatever whim, whatever power, whatever force was dominant at that time. You take someone who is an addict, who has no willpower, has no control over his or her behavior, and then you liberate them. You allow them to go away from that habit to a place where they don't have the pressure. Don't you think they're going to go right back? You can't liberate someone who's not able to be liberated because of their addiction that they have. We were addicts, to use it, the contemporary way of thinking about it. As slaves, the worst part of the slavery was not the physical back-breaking labor, the torture. That was bad enough. But they became addicts. They didn't know a life that gave them true freedom to be who they were. So God is going to take them out of Egypt. Great. So they won't be tortured anymore. That's wonderful. But Moses says they're going to go right back to Egypt. They don't know any other life. It's like anyone who has dealt with prisoners know that if you visit a prisoner and he's about to be let out, you know that you'll probably visit him again. The recidivism rate is very, very high. I know I visited people in Attica in the 1990s, and then when I visited them a few years ago, they were still there. They've been out of prison, but they got right back in again. And that's the rule for, I think, it's over 90% of recidivism rate. Why? Because you can take them out of prison, but you can't take their addiction, whatever kind of addiction they have, out of them. So God says to Moses, I'm going to liberate the Jewish people. And Moses says, so what good is that? They'll be liberated for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, a few years, and they'll go right back. What guarantee will we have that they'll be able to be truly free? And God says they're going to serve me on this mountain. Mount Sinai will cure their addiction. Once they get the Torah at Mount Sinai, they will be truly free people, not just free, externally free, but internally free. That's the guarantee they won't go back. Yes?
Rabbi, doesn't Rashi in a way say that with God giving us the first commandment, Rosh Kodesh, making us the master of time, which is necessary not to be a slave?
Mm-hmm.
That he starts us out immediately making us the master of time.
Yes, that's very true. But God establishes us as the master of time while we were still in Egypt. So that was the beginning, but it wasn't strong enough until they got the Torah at Mount Sinai. That solidified it. So you're right, it did start even in Egypt. The fact itself that they took the lamb, the idol of Egypt, and they sacrificed it without any fear showed that they had the power to overcome whatever fears they had of their masters. So it was a process. But when did it really sink in? When did it become a permanent fixture of the Jewish people's condition that we are not slaves? The Maharal, the great Jewish leader of the 16th century, writes that from the time of the Exodus onward, we became an inherently free people. Nobody could dominate us. But that wasn't over until they got the Torah at Mount Sinai. You know, on Passover, we drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder. One of the reasons for the 4 cups of wine is because the Torah uses 4 expressions of liberation. I will take you out of Egypt, I will redeem you, I will save you. And the last expression is, I will take you unto me as a nation. What is that referring to? That's referring to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. That's when we were really free. We were not free when we left the boundaries of Egypt. We were not even free after the sea was split and the Egyptians all drowned and they were no longer pursuing us. That was another level of freedom. But when were we really free? When we got the Torah at Mount Sinai. The Mishnah, the sages and ethics of the fathers, put it this way. The 10 commandments, the so-called 10 commandments, were engraved in stone. The Hebrew word for engraved is charut. But in the Torah, there are no vowels. So the same consonants could be read cherut, freedom. That when we got the 10 Commandments, which was the basis, the foundation of all of Judaism, we acquired true freedom. And if you think about it in very simple, down-to-earth terms, why are so many people in society victims and they can't get out of victimhood? Because they're not truly free. Because even if we give them whatever we think we're going to help them become independent, they don't have a purpose in life. We took away purposefulness in our educational system. When you take a kid and you put him into a school and you tell him, you can't talk about God, you can talk about every other religion as long as it's atheistic. That type of religious indoctrination exists in schools today. But you can't tell them about God. You can't even have a prayer. You can't have anything. Now, I know there are arguments why we don't want prayer because it could lead to other religions imposing their prayer. That's all very fine and good. But the end result is that we've taken a generation, or it's actually 2-3 generations now, of young people and indoctrinated them that there is no purpose in life. You just have to do the best you can do in school and get a good job and have a good life, but that's not a purpose. Yes?
The way you describe them being free, it sounds so supernatural, because normally when I think of avoiding, crime or whatever, you talk to her and you even wrote a paper on it, deterrence. You always have this thing called deterrence. There's no deterrent. Deterrent, is the threat of punishment. You talk about prison. Is a threat of this. Is a threat of that.
Deterrence doesn't work.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying.
No, deterrence is a half-baked solution. Throwing people in prison and punishing them is not going to save the world. Neither will banning guns. Both approaches, conservative and liberal, are totally wrong. They have failed miserably, both approaches. The only approach to crime is education, moral education. Then if you have a little deterrence and you get rid of weapons, that can only help. But if you don't give people a sense of morality and you don't tell a kid that stealing is inherently wrong, breaking into a store and looting the store is evil, pure, unmitigated evil. If they don't feel that way, there's nothing you're going to do. You're not going to stop crime. You need to have a purpose in life, and the purpose has to be a transcendent purpose. The purpose can't be your right hand gives to your left and the left gives back to the right. It's all within your own circle. You have to be able to connect to something higher. And that's what Shavuot is all about. Shavuot is when the Jewish people received a Torah, which means a purpose in life, and therefore they were now free. Now, to go a little bit deeper into it, what is the definition of true freedom? True freedom does not mean the ability to do whatever you think you want. It's the ability to do what you truly, deep down, want. And I like to use an example of a little child, a 2-year-old toddler, running into the street, into traffic. If you ask, what does the child want? Wants to run into the street. Is that what the child really wants? The child wants to get killed? Of course not. The child wants to not be killed. But the child doesn't have the ability to know what its real will is and how to exercise it. So it thinks it wants to run into the street because it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of action in the street. We are like little children. When we think we are free to do whatever we want, that's not who we really are, because as we spoke so many times, who are we really? We're our neshama, our soul. What does our soul want? That's when we're free, when we allow our soul to get what it wants. And it wants to be moral, it wants to serve God, it wants to study Torah, it wants to do mitzvahs, it wants to help others. That's what our true desire is. But if you don't teach that to young people, if you don't give them that sense that they have a soul, and the soul has a higher purpose, they're never going to be free. No matter what programs you do for them, you're never going to have them free, and they'll always be a source of violence, of dishonesty, and all the other ills of society. Now, I mentioned before that Shavuot occurs 7 weeks after Pesach, after Passover, and is connected to Passover. It's also connected in another way. And we're going to talk about this in subsequent classes when we talk about the Torah. The Torah, we know, consists of 2 parts. There's the written Torah and the oral Torah. And this is where Mother's Day comes into the discussion. It says in Proverbs, Shema b'ni musar avicha, listen, my child, the words of rebuke of your father. Ve'al titosh Torah simecha, don't forsake the Torah of your mother. So our sages tell us that this is a metaphor. What is the father and what's the mother? The father refers to the written Torah, where the Torah delineates very clearly, do this, don't do this. It's just straightforward commandments, doing what you're supposed to do and not doing what you're not supposed to do. That's the Torah of our father. But then the Torah of our mother refers to the oral traditions that were passed down from one generation to another. Yes, it might be the men who taught the teachings of Torah from one generation to another, but it's the women, it's the mothers that preserved the spirit, the light, the warmth, the soul of Judaism, and that's what enabled the men to pass it down from one generation to another. If you didn't have a Jewish mother, literally, then you could have the best teachers, the best fathers, but the spirit of Judaism would be lost, and when the spirit is lost, then everything else falls to the wayside as well. Yes?
Rabbi, to me, that seems to parallel that when you study the 5 books, it's mostly a transcendental God. And then afterwards, God seems to move into becoming a more immanent God.
Right? God is both. God is both, yes, transcendental.
I know God is both, but does it seem the emphasis seems to...
Yes, you're right. You're right. That the written Torah, you're dealing with a dictator God, God who is beyond and aloof, and he says, do this, I want you to do this. That's the father image of God. God is neither father or mother. God transcends definitions, but as a metaphor, God in the state of a dictator, of someone who dictates how you behave, a king. That's the written Torah, primarily. And the oral Torah is where God is, as you said, immanent. He's intimate with us. He's part of our experience. He's our mother figure. So Shavuot, we got both. But the primary focus of Shavuot is the oral Torah, the mother aspect of Torah. That's why I said before, Shavuot is the ultimate Mother's Day, the spiritual time when we were connected to God in an intimate way. Because what happened in Shavuot, if you look in the Torah, you don't see too many commandments. You see lightning, you see thunder, you see powerful forces. That's the mother forces. That's the warmth and the power of Judaism that's transmitted primarily through the mother. Now, what does it have to do with Pesach? The Torah tells us that on the 2nd day of Passover, we're supposed to bring a special offering called the Omer. It's a portion of barley that was brought in the temple. This practice was a point of contention between the sages, the rabbis, the traditionalists, and the breakaway Sadducees. You see, in the times of the Second Temple, there was a group of people whose leader was a man by the name of Tzadok, and his colleague was Baitos. And they started a movement, a breakaway movement from traditional Judaism. They said, no such thing as an oral law. We go by the Bible, by the word of the Torah. If the Torah says X, we do X. We don't give interpretations. Of course, it didn't make any sense because you can't read the Bible without interpretation. But anyhow, they broke away from tradition. And they were called this, in English, they call them the Sadducees. And they were able to get a lot of power. And they controlled the temple for a certain period of time. And early Christianity was very much in line with the Sadducees. They liked the Sadducees because the Sadducees tried to break the authority of the oral tradition. In the Torah, it doesn't say clearly when to bring that offering, that barley offering. It says, Mimacharat HaShabbat, the day after the Sabbath. Now the word Sabbath is a generic term. It could be referring to the seventh day of the week, Shabbos, Shabbat, Saturday, but also Shabbat means the day of rest. So the oral tradition said it doesn't mean you should start counting on a Sunday. It means you should start counting the day after Passover, the day after the first day of Passover. That's the traditional way. But the Sadducees, no, you start counting always after Saturday, on Sunday. And this was a major point of contention, and the Talmud records pages of debates between the rabbis and the Sadducees to disprove what they were saying. So the whole ritual of bringing this Omer, this barley offering, underscores the primacy of the oral tradition, that we can't go by what the Torah says literally, we have to go by how it was interpreted, passed down by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, and then from there on, from generation to generation. So, the holiday of Shavuot, which is based on the counting of the Omer, highlights the oral tradition. One of the things that we do on Shavuot is we also remember another historical event. It's the day that King David passed away. And many people read the Book of Ruth on Shavuot, because King David's great-grandmother was Ruth. Who was Ruth? She was a Moabite princess, and she converted to Judaism, and she became the ancestress of King David, which also means that she is the ancestress of Mashiach. And we read that book on Shavuot. Why do we read that book on Shavuot? And how does it connect to what I was saying before, that Shavuot highlights the oral tradition? The Torah makes it very clear, one of the commandments in the Torah, that you're not allowed to marry a Moabite. The Moabites were not nice to us, so the Torah says they cannot be allowed into the assembly of God. They cannot be part of the Jewish people. Who was King David's great-grandmother? Ruth, who was a Moabite princess. So many people said, she's not kosher. Who did she marry? She married the Jewish leader of that time, Boaz, King David's great-grandfather. And people said, this is not acceptable. The Torah says clearly you cannot marry a Moabite. And she was a Moabite. But the oral tradition said that that's not necessarily the case. You can only not marry a Moabite man, that a Jewish woman cannot marry a Moabite man, but a Jewish man could marry a Moabite woman if she converts to Judaism, obviously. And that was the oral tradition. But there were many people who denied the oral tradition, and therefore casted aspersions on King David, whether he was even allowed to be not only a king, whether he was accepted as a Jew, as a proper Jew. And that was finally settled in the days of King Solomon, that everyone agreed that King David was kosher. So on Shavuot, we focus on King David, who passed away on Shavuot. And according to tradition, he was born on that same day. He passed away on the 70th birthday. So again, King David's role relates to the whole concept of the oral tradition. Yes?
Rabbi, then wouldn't that mean then in Christianity that Jesus could not be the Messiah? From the Christian's point of view, from what you're saying, he would be, because Jesus is a descendant of David, so Jesus would be non-kosher for Christians.
Well, that's the least of the reasons that he couldn't be the Messiah. He couldn't be the Messiah because he was the antithesis of what the Messiah is all about, to strengthen Jewish practice. And he created a religion, or at least in his name, that took Jews away from Judaism. But that's another subject. But you're right, you happen to be right. Now, why do we focus on King David? What did King David accomplish that relates to the giving of the Torah? Besides the fact that his very status was based on the oral Torah. When God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, they were not a nation. They were a nation in name, but they were 12 tribes. It was a tribal existence. When they entered into Israel, each one got their turf, but they had no central government. There was no capital. There was no unity between the tribes. There was even a civil war before King David's time. The civil war against the tribe of Benjamin, which is a whole long story. The Jewish people were a fragmented people, and because they were fragmented, the temple could not be built. God does not enjoy dwelling in a divided house. The people in Israel were still fighting the Canaanites, the Philistines. There was no real peace in the land. So the Jewish people's existence in Israel was still not solid, and therefore the teachings of the Torah could not be fully implemented until King David came. King David unified the entire Jewish nation into one people, and he established a capital, Jerusalem, and he built the first temple. But he didn't really build the first temple, and he did and he didn't. He wanted to build the first temple, but God told him that his hands were filled with blood. He had fought too many wars. And not that these wars were illegal. These were wars of self-defense. But God did not want to associate his temple, a temple of peace, with a person whose very hands were soiled with blood. But King David did build the first temple in another way. He raised the funds. Ask anyone who's a fundraiser to know how difficult that is. That's the hardest part of building a building, is to raise the funds. So King David raised the funds. He also dug tunnels underneath the ground as foundations for the temple. And he sanctified the location. He chose the location and sanctified it. And that's what paved the way for King Solomon to rebuild the temple. So what did that accomplish? That's what made Judaism applicable, alive. Now you have a temple. Now you can bring all the different offerings. Now the Jewish people are ensconced in their home, and God also has a home. So King David took what Moses started centuries before and implemented it. And then there's a third thing that happened, it happened on Shavuot. It's the anniversary, the yahrzeit of the passing of the Baal Shem Tov, millennia later. And then what did the Baal Shem Tov accomplish? He took Judaism in all of its form and brought light into Judaism. He instilled light, paving the way for the coming of Mashiach. He introduced the teachings that will later on become the full teachings of Mashiach. So all this happened on Shavuot. As I mentioned before, it's customary to read the Book of Ruth on Shavuot. Why that book? So there are many reasons. The first reason I already gave you is because she was the great-grandmother of King David, and King David passed away on Shavuot. And we want to highlight the fact that King David's role and status was based on the oral tradition. But there are other reasons, and a very simple reason is that Ruth was a convert to Judaism. And so were all Jews at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was when all of the Jewish people converted to Judaism. We were not Jews before. Maybe we had some type of quasi-title of Jew before Sinai, but when did we really become part of the Jewish people? That happened at Mount Sinai. So Shavuot is the conversion of all of the Jewish people. So we read a story about a convert. And why is it so important to focus on our role as converts? Because Shavuot is really two things happen on Shavuot. Two intertwined things. It's Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, and it's Kabbalat HaTorah, the receiving of the Torah. What's the difference? I can give you something, a gift. I can put money in your bank account. You don't have to do anything. There's no effort on your part. I just put $1,000 in your bank account, and you have $1,000 richer. Did you do anything for it? No. Did you have to even go to the bank? No. You just were passive, and you got this gift. Well, God gives every Jew that gift of the Torah, whether they do anything about it or not. But that's not the ideal. The ideal is that we should receive the Torah. What does that receiving mean? Receiving is not passive. Receiving is active. Receiving is dynamic. Internalizing, absorbing it. And that's what the idea of conversion highlights. What's the difference between a Jew who is born Jewish and someone who converts to Judaism? If you're born Jewish, you get a gift without you doing anything. Just by virtue of being born, you are gifted with Jewish identity. No need for you to do anything. It's a gift, and we're appreciative of that gift. We're grateful for it, and we thank God for it every day when we wake up in the morning that we're Jewish. We didn't do anything to be Jewish. That's how we are. A convert is different. A convert makes a conscious effort to embrace Judaism. A convert is someone who doesn't inherit it. To us, it's an inheritance. To the convert, it's a process that requires tremendous amount of sacrifice. If a convert is sincere and they do it for the right reason, it's a tremendous amount of sacrifice. There's a very famous letter of Maimonides to a convert whose name was Ovadia. Ovadia originally was a prophet who was a convert, a Roman convert. And there's a biblical book, that we read in the Haftorah of one of the parshas, and I think it's by Yishlach. And this convert in Maimonides' time, I guess, was named after that original convert. And he was taunted by many Jews who said to him, "You're not a real Jew. You can't say in the prayers, the God of my fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, because you're not a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So you can't really say those prayers." And Maimonides responds to this convert who was really very troubled by this, and he tells him he could say it, that don't have to worry about it. But at the end he says, while we trace ourselves to God through our fathers, you have a direct link with God. You are directly connected because you chose God, not because your father and mother were ones who were Jewish and their parents were Jewish, going back to Sinai. You made your own choice. That's what we highlight on Shavuot, that all of us have to become like converts. We are converts, but we have to act like converts, which means that we bring our own initiative. We're not just passive recipients of a gift, of an inheritance, but we worked hard to receive the Torah. It's also interesting that the word Ruth in Hebrew numerically is 606. How many commandments did we have before Sinai? We had 7 Noahide commandments. So if you add 606 and 7, what does that give you? We're the mathematicians here. It gives you 613. So Ruth emphasizes the idea that at Mount Sinai we got the 613 commandments. The whole book of Ruth is about kindness, how people were kind to her and how she was kind. And that's what we want to highlight on Shavuot, the God's kindness, that Judaism revolves around kindness. There's a custom on Shavuot that we are up the night of Shavuot and study Torah. The most prevalent custom is to recite a book called Tikkun. Tikkun means repairing. What are we repairing? So the Midrash tells us that the Jews were counting the days in eager anticipation of getting the Torah. But the night before they were supposed to get the Torah, they all went to sleep, and they slept so comfortably that they woke up late. They had to be awakened. Their cell phones alarm clock didn't ring, and they missed the giving of the Torah. At least God had to delay it, and that was considered to be indiscretion on their part. Here, God is giving them the Torah, and they slept so comfortably, so peacefully, and they woke up late. So to correct that, tikkun, to correct that, we don't go to sleep the night of Shavuot, and we recite Tikkun. Tikkun is a sample of every part of the Torah. Some people just study Torah in general, but the most prevalent custom is to recite Tikkun as a way of saying that we're not going to go to sleep. Why would they want to go to sleep when they were so eager to get the Torah? If I know that tomorrow morning God is going to come to me and give me a Torah, I don't think I'd be able to fall asleep. So how did they sleep so peacefully, so comfortably? So the Rebbe explains that that was part of their preparation. They thought that by going to sleep, their souls would leave their bodies and wouldn't be encumbered by their bodies, and they would have a much deeper mystical experience. There are a lot of people who report that when they go to sleep, in their dreams, they get revelations of spiritual knowledge. The Arizal, the greatest of the Kabbalists, once took a nap Shabbos afternoon for 2 hours. When he woke up, he said he was given a view of teachings of the Torah that if he had to expound on them, if he had to relate what he saw, it would take him 80 years. In 2 hours, he got 80 years worth of knowledge. So that's what the people wanted to do. They wanted to disengage from the physical world so their souls would absorb the greatest, most mystical spiritual knowledge, and that would prepare them for the receiving of the Torah. But they were wrong, because that's not the objective, to withdraw from the world. God wants the Torah down here in the physical world. God didn't bring the Jews up to heaven. He brought the heavens down to earth. One other custom that we'll talk about briefly is the eating dairy on Shavuot. Every Jewish holiday, one is required to eat meat. If you're a vegetarian, of course, then you don't eat meat. You eat what you can enjoy. It's a mitzvah to rejoice on the holiday, but if you do eat meat, it's a mitzvah to eat meat. Shavuot is no exception. We eat a meat meal, but before the meat meal, we also eat a dairy meal. It could be a full meal, it could be just a snack, but we eat dairy. And there are many reasons given why we eat dairy. One of the reasons given is that when the people got the Torah, they knew they're going to have a lot of restrictions on what they could cook. There'll be laws of kashrut that they didn't have to keep before they got the Torah. So their pots and pans wouldn't be kosher, and therefore they opted for eating dairy, because the dairy was something you don't have to cook. You can eat raw dairy products. That's one of the reasons given. Also, the Torah is likened to milk. Milk nurtures us. The Torah is what nurtures us. Again, connecting the giving of the Torah to Mother's Day. Torah is the ultimate mother nurturing the Jewish people with this knowledge. And there are many other reasons why we eat dairy on Shavuot. But I'll just conclude with one reason given in the Midrash. When Moses went up to the mountain to get the Torah, the angels protested. The angel says, "Why are you giving Torah to mortals? They're very fickle. They're not going to maintain loyalty to the Torah. So keep it up here with the angels. We'll appreciate the Torah. We'll respect it. So in the Talmud itself, it says that Moses' response to them was, were you slaves in Egypt? Do you have parents that you have to honor them? Do you harbor any desire to kill your fellow angel? You don't have all these needs, so why do you need the Torah? But in the Midrash, Moses had another defense against the angels' claim that the Torah belongs to them. Moses reminded them a few hundred years earlier when they came to visit Abraham, when Abraham had undergone circumcision, and God appears to Abraham, and then the angels come disguised as people. And what does Abraham serve them? The Torah says dairy and meat. In other words, you had an opportunity to keep one of the commandments of not mixing dairy and meat, and you didn't observe that. So why do you want the Torah? You're no better than humans, and therefore the Torah doesn't belong to you. So because we got the Torah, thanks to this observance of milk and meat, not mixing milk and meat, we have a custom to eat milk and then meat, not mixing them. You eat the dairy first and then you eat the meat meal. Some people wait a half hour, some people wait an hour between them, but we don't mix the two as a way of saying, you see, we deserve the Torah. You angels, you could stay up there in heaven, do your job, but Torah is for us. Any questions? Yes?
Do people need freedom or not? What they need more? They need freedom or they need shepherd?
Following a shepherd doesn't mean you're not free. If the shepherd knows what you need and what you want truly, then that's freedom. If you have no shepherd, you're not going to be free. You think you're going to be free, but you're going to just follow your whims. And you'll just, like young people, young teenagers, think they're free because they don't have to listen to their parents. They can do whatever they want. But meanwhile, they become devotees of whatever fashion, whatever craziness prevails in society. So they're not really free.
Why I talk about this? Because right now we clear know, for example, people who live, I don't say Russian, I say people who live on territory of Russia, before Soviet Union, in general, they don't know what is it freedom. They all the time, they live in slavery.
Okay, that's a
and
different...
They don't know what they live in slavery.
Okay, you're right that...
But they have shepherd. It's Tsar, Prince, or General Secretary of Communist
But their
Party.
shepherd is not the right shepherd. That's the problem. They have the wrong shepherd.
But people don't know this, so they.
But we're more free here in the Western world than people who live under tyranny, like in China, North Korea, Cuba. They have no freedom whatsoever. We have more freedom, but we still don't have real freedom as a society, because if we had real freedom, the prisons would not be functioning. If we had real freedom, you wouldn't have thousands of young people dying from drug addiction. That means that they're not free. They're slaves to their addiction. And the reason for that, largely, I can't say entirely, but largely it's because they were never educated that there's a higher purpose in life, and that that's really what they want. They were just told that life is just about succeeding materially and enjoying yourself. If that's all the life is, then there are so many other ways of getting to that goal. Any other questions or comments on Zoom? Okay, so in honor of Mother's Day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes, because I brought my violin because I know you'll be